Okay. So, let's move on. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about are the first peoples of Australia and a little bit about their spiritual beliefs and values. Uh, there are quite a number of illustrations here. Um, this first illustration on this very first slide is one of one of the famous cave paintings from a place called Noorlangi, which is in Arnhem Land or in Kakadu Park, which is up in the north of Australia. These paintings are several millennia. They're about 20,000 years old at least. And they illustrate some of the sacred beings of the Aboriginal religion. So this is one, obviously a kangaroo, a rock kangaroo, but it's a much bigger series of paintings that's depicted here. This is just one. I'll mention the others in a couple of the other pictures when we come to them. Okay, so the first people of Australia had a very different kind of understanding of themselves to that of, uh, Western culture, Western people, and I'll say a little bit more about that a little later. They understand themselves as belonging to the community and also to the land. This is tied up with a metaphysical structure, which I'll say some more about, what's called the dreaming. So whilst we have in the West a kind of much more individualistic idea of ourselves, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders see themselves in a kind of relational manner, but not just to their community or to the land, but in general to nature itself. So there's not really a self in the way in which the West understands itself, like Western people think of themselves as individuals. Um, of course, if we think about philosophically, there is also in the Western tradition an understanding of ourselves as being immersed within community too. However, for Aboriginal people, it's a very much different way of understanding their relationship to the world around them. I've actually found Heidegger's notion of Dasein and being uh, sane as being useful in kind of understanding a little bit about what we mean by uh, being immersed within a being itself, as the Aboriginal people do. So, very different metaphysical system. They mean very much that they belong to country. Uh, Unfortunately, even here in Australia, we have this thing called acknowledgement of country and welcome to country that's endlessly done at sporting events and the like, which doesn't very well capture what is meant by country. Um, in one sense, there is a belongingness to the land for the Aboriginal person as part of a sense of identity, but it's more than that. They don't own the land on which they live, so we tend to not quite understand that sense of that landscape. That landscape here has a physical kind of identity for an Aboriginal person, and all of us would be aware of the physical features that we see here in this image. We see the tree and the rocks and the dead kind of tree there at the foreground and so on. But it's more than that. These particular rocks and this particular uh, uh, landscape holds a certain kinds of meaning which relate back to the dreaming time, to creation. So there's more to the story than just simply the physical aspect of it. So belonging here is not just about belonging to a physical space. It's belonging to an environment which is shot through with a spiritual meaning and a metaphysical meaning. So they don't own the land in any sense. They belong in this space, in this time, or this time which extends in all directions, past, present, and future. They are as much a part of this as the soil, the rocks, the flora and fauna, but also there's a sense of the spiritual beings that inhabit this place as well. So there is this idea of connectedness, which is very powerfully expressed in Laudate Si, for example, which is the Pope Francis's encyclical, which talks about the way in which we're all connected, not just in terms of as human beings, but also in terms of our connections to the environment. So that's what I'm harking back to in reminding or remembering that particular papal encyclical, which captures this idea of our connectedness, not just to one another, but to the natural environment which includes all the living things within that environment, but also all of the non-living things like the landscape we see here. So this is a living reality for the Aboriginal person. So the individual, the community, for the Aboriginal person forms a kind of integrated whole. And so here we see another landscape, which is kind of a landscape at the bottom of Uluru, which is famous rock in the middle of Australia, which has significant spiritual meaning for Aboriginal people. So here everything is a unified whole. The spiritual and the physical aspects of the world, these are interconnected. So if I think evil thoughts, these are not a matter of a spiritual, of just a spiritual kind of thing or a psychic kind of thing, but they manifest themselves in the world as misfortune. So whenever I think bad thoughts about someone, it becomes manifested. So evil, if I'm thinking evil, it manifests itself in some way. It has to come out within the world in some way. So we try not to think evil thoughts about each other or or other people. So the self, when we, and here we see a ritualistic dance, the Aboriginal people included a lot of time for socialising and social gatherings. So here is a group of Aboriginal men, obviously engaged in a particular ritual of some kind. And often these rituals were part of the way in which, given that they were an oral tradition, how they carried stories from the dreaming and communicated those to others. So these things had meaning. I mean, some of them were also just as a means of expression, of enjoying themselves. But in this particular instance, because they're painted in a particular way, this is a ritualistic dance or a kind of ritualistic expression of some particular story which relates to their understanding of themselves within their particular world. So these things all have some very specific meaning. I mean, a way to think about them perhaps is to think about them as the sort of the way in which we think of ceremonies that when we have religious ceremonies, so they're in a similar kind of space. They've got a spiritual aspect as well as a kind of aspect of trying to communicate particular stories and particular sacred writing, well, not sacred writing, but sacred stories to the community. And so there are recollection often of these kinds of things. So for an Aboriginal person needs to balance all of these things, the spiritual and physical aspects and of themselves, and hence they need to draw on their community for support. So the self can only be understood, as I was saying, within not only this historical consciousness, that is consciousness of being within what is called the dream time, but also a narrative that's woven from the stories of the elders of the community. So the self is embedded and is understood in relation to the place, a particular set of circumstances, a particular story, and individual Aboriginal people become custodians of an element of that story. The whole story is generally not known by very many people. Obviously, there will be some elders who know more of the story, but each person will have their place within the community and has an aspect of the story that's theirs to hold and is sacred to them, but which has to be then related to others. So there's this narrative of things that each contribute to. So in this particular image, each of these individual will be part of a whole. They have their place within what is a larger tapestry and a larger story. So one thing that's important is, and I might wonder if I can get rid of I'll get rid of these pictures that might help. I don't know how to get rid of, okay, that's better. So the narratives and experiences told by the elders are not about what happened in the past so much, but are present here and now. So in this narrating of stories, we have something else happening here. It isn't just this happened in the past. What it does, it reenacts some of those stories. We see a reenactment, for instance, of how the tribe came to be, or how the land came to be, made by the sky heroes, the creators of the land, and how they shaped the land. Sometimes they were good spirits and sometimes they were bad spirits, but they were spirits who were the creators, who shaped the land to be what it is. And so these stories are not simply relating historical events or mythological events. They are telling a story about the land as it is now, about the inheritance that exists in the present, and how these affect the present here and now. So there is this. Though they are, memories in some respect, and here again, I'm grappling with using Western ideas to try and talk about something which is not a Western kind of concept of the world, because this connectedness is a connectedness in which the present, here and now, and the future are somehow all connected. So what happened in the past is already has its presence in the here and now, and it shapes the individual here and now and places that individual in relation to those mythological um, events that happened in the past, but which are also there sharing the journey. So it's not a shared communal consciousness, and it's not a common consciousness in the sense that each individual is connected to others in this kind of communal consciousness, but it's a sense of a connectedness with all things. So here we see, in the image, there is clearly the use of fire to push Aboriginals are pushing the game, the kangaroos out, and we see that they're hunting the kangaroos, and they're spread across the landscape, and they will only use what they need because they are a nomadic people, and they move from one part to the other. So they're a hunter-gatherer people who had a minimal need for any kind of possessions, because if you're moving around constantly, the more possessions you have, the more things you have to carry. So you travel light. You don't carry things. You rely on taking things basically only what you need. So many of the artefacts that Aboriginal people would carry with them would serve more than one purpose. So you don't carry more than you need. You don't build permanent shelters. You move around a particular area, and you know that area very well, and you know its moods and its changes extremely well. So there is this sense of a connectedness with that place, and the individual then exists on this continuum, which connects him or her with ancestral spirits and with his or her kinship group and the land to which that group belongs. Of course, in contrast, and here I'm just taking one contrast as a kind of means of trying to make us aware of the differences between Aboriginal Australians and non-Aboriginal Australians. So when we think about the non-Aboriginal way of thinking, a kind of a Western way of thinking, it's influenced by Descartes, in which we think of the self as kind of a kind of entity, which is a thinking kind of entity, which is a bit mechanistic and atomistic in nature. So we have this idea of, if you like, the soul, and it's sort of separate from the body. I mean, it goes back to Plato, I suppose, as well. But in Descartes, we get this idea of the individual who wants to know with certainty, and his method is this method of certainty and designed to discover what could be known. So Descartes' project, he finds himself, I think, I am. So it's in that process of thinking that I exist. Everything else is not me, and I can't be certain of. Of course, he then follows that up with his famous trademark argument, where he says, well, now that I've isolated myself, how do I get connected to the world? And so he comes back into the world via his knowledge that God would not deceive him about the world. So he comes back into the world through that trademark argument. But that's just a very So that, but the idea is what comes from that is we understand the world in this kind of scientific, mathematical way. So from the dawn of early modern philosophy, we get this growth of science, and by the time we get to the Enlightenment, religion has been confined to the private sphere, and it's separate from the public sphere, or if you like, the sacred and the profane no longer are connected in any way. So we have a secular world, uh, which is the public world. The individual is now separated from society because he now lives in a private sphere, practices religion in that private sphere. And of course, with industrialization, society is separated from nature. So, so much so that in many cases, children and even perhaps older people have no idea where their food comes from. They don't grow it themselves. It arrives packaged in the supermarket, and so in that sense, we've become very much separated from the world around us, and religion itself has been confined. So First Peoples Australians see themselves very differently from that kind of world. What's very important for Aboriginal peoples is that they see themselves and who they are in terms of kinship. Ritual and spiritual relationships are inseparable from one another, the land and nature. So here's just an image of a group sitting together who may or may not be related, of course. They probably are, but kinship and so you might say that Aboriginal religion is a kind of kinship religion. It's a relational religion, and so it's our understand, and it's relational, not just to other human beings, other members of one's group, but also in relation to other things in the environment. The other thing that's to be understood, this kinship is elaborated, and social interaction and interdependence is crucial, and personal identity is always a plural, and so it's a kind of extended identity. So, for example, if you want to talk to a particular individual in an Aboriginal group, an Aboriginal clan, you can't speak to the individual directly and ask them. You need to go through the elder. So there will be someone that you have to speak to first, and they will then see whether or not that you speaking to the individual is permissible. So there is a very different understanding of one's place within the community. It's not a kind of individualistic thing. It's a belongingness that is a kind of not a group identity so much. So it's not that, but it's a sense of a specific kind of relational presence within that group. So every individual has a place within that context, and no two people will have identical kinship, ritual, and spiritual relationships and responsibilities. So, as I was saying earlier, each individual has their place, and each individual has their particular part of the story of the sacred stories of the tribe. That's their responsibility, and their responsibility to pass on to the person that they're meant to pass that on to. It's something that they also have to be aware of. So in effect, the individual's well-being depends upon this discharge of the obligations to that larger group and to the land itself. So there is the commitment to this interdependence of being. So given that one's actual being is not just confined to one's own corporal body, but one is actually extended. For example, the shadow that one casts is also part of who we are. So you don't step on the shadow of another person, because it's disrespectful to do that. So all of these things are all connected. So once you dispossess the Aboriginal person from that environment, you have also, if you like, torn away most of their identity. You put them in an alien place, a place that's not theirs, theirs in the sense it's not a part of them, then they're no longer who they were, because they're not within the environment and part of the particular place that makes them who they are. It's a very different. Yeah, there's a little quote, there's a longish quote from an Aboriginal elder, Mick Dodson. When Aboriginal people talk of country, we mean something very different from the conventional European understanding. We might mean homeland or tribal area, and we're not necessarily referring to a place in a merely geographical sense. Rather, the word country is an abbreviation of all values, places, resources, stories, and cultural obligations associated with that area. So it's all of those things. Certainly, to talk of country is to talk of its resources, the uses to which these might be put, and their proper distribution. In this sense, to understand country is also to understand its crucial importance to the customary Indigenous economy and governance. However, the word best describes the entirety of a people's ancestral inheritance. It is place that gives meaning to creation beliefs. The stories of creation form the basis of Indigenous law and explain the origins of the natural world. To speak of country is to speak both of the economic uses to which it may be put and of a fundamentally spiritual relationship that links the past to the present, the dead to the living, and the human and non-human worlds. Country is centrally about identity. Okay, so there's a kind of explanation. So the idea of traditional ownership, which is often bandied about here in Australia, but it's not a sense of ownership. So the Aboriginal person doesn't own the land. It's a sense of being rooted in the land from which they draw their own being. So it's a dynamic kind of relationship. It's a relationship in which both the land and the person who is the Aboriginal person complement one of each other. So if the land is suffering, then the Aboriginal person has to try and do something about that. For example, if there's drought, the land is suffering. So the land has to be, there's rituals in which you try to bring about rainfall, for instance. So it's a healing of the land, because in the healing of the land, it's a healing of the person themselves. So it's a dynamic interrelationship. So it's not a kind of traditional ownership. You're not an owner, you are actually part of that landscape. So it's an alien concept. It's a European concept. We understand property in the sense that the property belongs to me. So it's a different kind of metaphysical relationship between us and the property. Our property has a kind of ownership within a legal framework, and a legal framework supported by government and the like. In the Aboriginal connection to the land, it's not that kind of connection. They don't possess the land. They don't own it. They are simply part of that land. It's a different understanding. So I better get a move on. Okay, just to talk about Aboriginal religion. Well, prior to Durkheim's 1912 study of Aboriginal religion, the idea was that it couldn't be called religion at all. And so, for instance, there's no priesthood, altar, or sacrifice, and they didn't seem to be connected to some kind of divine worship. Nobody kind of understood what was going on. So there seemed to be little interest prior to Durkheim to study Aboriginal religion. The Aboriginal peoples were seen as a degenerate and decaying race of people, and indeed it was thought that would be best if they became extinct. When Arthur Phillip arrived in 1788, the one of the ways in which the encounter has been characterised has been as disastrous. Well, that's sometimes called the black armband view of the encounter. It was not an invasion, for instance. Some people have characterised it, and certainly it was the arrival of basically a group of convicts who were sent to this end of the world, partly because they wanted to stop the French from taking over the east coast of Australia. The other side, the western side of Australia, was kind of known, but it was thought to be completely barren, and there weren't anything there worth having. And on the east side, it wasn't thought to be much better. So when they arrived, it was basically to start a penal colony. And so it was nothing like an invasion. Philip himself, and that's well chronicled in his diaries, he did try to understand the culture and traditions of the Aboriginal people. The British government did instruct him to be kind to the Aboriginal peoples and try to understand them. But of course, it became very difficult. The colonists started to put up fences around particular bits of land, and the Aboriginal people didn't quite understand what these fences were or why they were doing that. Remember, they were hunter-gatherers, so they roamed the land freely. They didn't put up fences. They just lived on the land, whereas what was happening with the colonists, they were bringing animals to farm, and so they needed to fence them in. So there was a lot of misunderstanding during the early stages, and of course that led to well-known clashes. So they were seen as primitive. But were they a simple society? They weren't so simple as Durkheim discovered. What they had hoped in the initial phase of coming to Australia was to look at Aboriginal society as a primitive, simple society that would help us understand our own more complex society. Aboriginal totemism, again, was thought to be a very simple form of understanding, because what that meant is that Aboriginal groups identified themselves with particular species of fauna or flora or parts of the land, and these engravings illustrate that connection. And this was seen to be some kind of very simple elementary social organisation. But totemism is actually far more complex than Durkheim thought. So, in fact, Aboriginal religion is very complex. And so it's a lot more sophisticated than Durkheim at first thought. And it's a disproof of this. In fact, interestingly, the distinction that we tend to draw between the sacred and and profane simply cannot exist in Aboriginal religion. Aboriginal society, in fact, exists for the sake of religion. So it's a religiosity that permeates the whole existence of the Aboriginal people. So again, we have to understand what we mean by religion and religious practice in a very different way. And so it has within its ritual practices uh, an embodiment of the relation to the land and to what's understood as the dreaming, the primeval source of both law and of the way of life of Aboriginal people. So it's deeply embedded within all of the kind of ritual practices of society. So it refers to something outside itself. The dreaming is something that Aboriginal people are convinced exists and must be respected as a given. Now, I'm probably not going to have much time to develop this, but I'll go through it as quickly as I can. So the Aboriginal concept of the dreaming is not a good word. It's expressed in different Aboriginal terms, Algiringa, Wonga, Bulgari, and so on. It's a symbolic formulation of an intuition of a mystery, and this is the significatum of the religious rites and myths. So its subject is the imprisoning dialect of human life in the Aboriginal society, a perennial condition of good with suffering. So it's one meaning is of a sacred, heroic time long ago, but it's not the only understanding of it. It's partly that. It's about uh, the stories of creation, of the establishment of the law, but also the continuing existence of spiritual beings in the present. So a notion of this indefinitely remote past and a time also in the present. It's many things in one. There's kind of narrative to things which happened, a charter of things still to happen, a kind of logos, a principle of order transcending everything significant for Aboriginal man or woman. So Aboriginal identity, it's a man's name, spirit and shadow are him. The name of someone is an intimate part of the body, and you can't take liberties with that. And so you don't ask an Aboriginal person their name because it embarrasses them and shames them. So you can't speak of someone who's dead. And if you do, you have to speak in an oblique way. You don't mention their name. You don't threaten a man's shadow. And you don't, and similarly, you don't threaten the place where his spirit came from or the totem, which is to threaten him. So, for the notion of the person, for the Aboriginal people, it's a unity of a lot of ideas: body, spirit, ghost, shadow, name, spirit, sight, and totem. So, it's all of those things. So, there's a depth of meaning. So, this notion of the dreaming is a connotation of having originated out of one's own eternity, immortal, uncreated, and this is essential. So it's a kind of connectedness to everything that has been and is still to come. So I'm immersed within that whole thing. I'm part of the past. I'm part of the present, and I'm part of the future. I'm kind of belonging to all of this. So it's a present reality also that can be entered. And so, when they talk about the Karalaji, who are the spiritual guides or the men who have got the wisdom and knowledge, sometimes called Kadacha in other languages, so different languages. These are people who have entered into this spirit world and who are healers and who are, if you like, witch doctors, and not quite the term that's used, but are, if you like, people who have entered into the dreaming. They can enter this through ritual, enter the spiritual world, contact the dreaming presences and become identified with them. And an Aboriginal person can be absorbed through that ritual and become into that and become part of that, for instance, rock kangaroo or snake, if it's their totem. There is a unity to these sacred objects. The sacred objects themselves, which are often rocks, for instance, that have a particular imagery painted on them, these are sacred and are kept in hidden places. They are sacred, and they contain within them this particular power of the sacred image. So there is a spiritual power within these particular sacred artifacts, these chiringas. And so the rituals that are associated with those sacred objects draws on that spiritual power. And so they are used in particular ceremonies which have to do with particular rituals related to the land, related to the people, and which are then ways in which they tap into the dreaming and to the stories of the sacred time of creation, and sometimes enable the practitioner to actually commune with some of those spirits. So there is these particular objects have this unity. So nothing is disconnected. Of course, only of those who are initiated into those particular sacred mysteries are able to access these sacred rocks, or sacred objects. So only those people will know, and they will pass that knowledge on only to those who are appointed or anointed to have access to those spiritual objects. The dreaming is a moral order. The dreaming brings together that past, present, future, which I've said. So there is this sense of permanence and stability about life and human beings. So it contains the narrative about creation events. It's not just about the past, present, or future. In some respects, in the dreaming, past, present, and future disappear, and the dreaming abides. A term that Stanner uses is abidingness. The dreaming is abidingness. For me, it's reminiscent of Heidegger's notion of Dasein, not Dasein, of sein, of being. That is, that which Dasein is capable of knowing. The dreaming is able to be accessed by the human being, the Dasein in one sense, if we think of Dasein and sein, or being itself, in that kind of way. And remember, dreaming abides, so it's a kind of beingness, which is a sort of an existing in eternity in a way. So it's also the source of moral law. So the dreaming is a cosmogony. It's a begetting of the universe, study of creation, a cosmology, an account of how what was created became an ordered moral system. So very much to be understood in that kind of way. So basically, the metaphysics of the Aborigines, a sense to what human beings have to be, because the terms of life have been fixed. So we have our place within that particular understanding of how the world is. So there's a religiosity in their spirituality, spiritual awareness of nature, the complex totemism, ritual and art, and also their intricately ordered life. So everything is permeated with a response to or a living a life within that understanding of their place within the dreaming. So to make sense of that ordered world, Aboriginal people have a very highly developed social structure, and that's what the kinship relationships are all about. And they are very complex because it's not just kinship within the particular clan, but it's within the particular tribe or more extended tribe and the like. So they see everything and the way of life as a unity of things and exhibits the values of a society which is ordered to the common good. And it's a common good which includes living and non-living beings. So there is a respect not just for all living things, but also the environment itself, because the environment itself will represent some particular aspect of one of the creation stories. For instance, a riverbed will be the journey of the rainbow serpent as it makes and shapes the landscape. A particular cave might represent the vagina of a woman which gave birth to a particular totemic animal, and so on. So that is special because of this representation that this cave gave birth to a particular part of that environment. And so they respect that because of that particular part of the story. So they're not they don't identify themselves as separate from the environment. And when if they have a totem as a rock kangaroo in certain rituals, they become that rock kangaroo in a very real sense. So the picture depicted there is from another part of that famous Nulangi cave platings, and that represents a rock kangaroo. See the ears and the large legs and so on in that picture, stylized, obviously. Well, that's it. And there's just a couple of rock wallabies. So that's it. So I'll stop sharing. And if we've got any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
Thank you, Professor. It's very difficult to process, to understand the what we can say. Everything is in a paradigm. It's a kind of algorithm. So each puzzle, each part of the puzzle you described here cannot be understood without the others. So yes, dreaming, I
Yes.
think, is the most spatial aspect.
It, it's spatial, but it's also not spatial. In one sense, it's time, but it's not. It's timeless. It's eternal as well. It's a very difficult concept to grasp. This is why I was grasping at the idea of being that Heidegger talks about it, because that's also very difficult to grasp. I mean, he never really finishes his analysis of it. He only gets as far as trying to understand Dasein and Dasein's kind of place within that, within the notion of being with, being in the world, that kind of idea. So the dreaming is all of those things. And it's very complex. So you can't understand the Aboriginal person outside of their place within a very specific environment. You can't understand them outside of the very specific uh, stories that are associated with the place they come from. I mean, the notion of there is this idea of a supreme being as well within the dreaming, which is called Bayami, um, which is a kind of a representation of what we might call God. Um, but he's a figure within the dreaming, and the dreaming, the creation stories are about how the world came about, how the land came about, and there are both malign spirits and good spirits that uh, kind of fight against each other but in the end they also contribute to the way the world is. So even though in one sense they might be thought of as malign, they are in fact essential to the understanding of how the whole world came to be. And they will talk about particular aspects of the environment. I mean, some of those early pictures that of just the land. Now, when we look at the land, we see it in a very particular way. So, yeah, there's some trees, there's some rocks, but an Aboriginal person seeing that land sees it in a very different way. So, if we think about it phenomenologically, how they will see that, they will see it completely differently. It will be shot through with all kinds of layers. There is the physical rocks and the physical plants and all of those things, and the ants and the insects and grasshoppers and whatever else. But there's also behind that the spiritual powers that inhabit those places. So, and they are aware of those as well. So it's not, so their perception of these things is different. They don't just see the land as the physical aspects of it, or even a very close seeing of it. They see another layer. It's difficult to describe. I guess one way sometimes I think about it is the way in which we sometimes become aware of a graced moment in our lives, God's grace coming to us, somehow a kindness done to us that is unexpected. Where did it come from? And sometimes we think, and that gives us a sense of another dimension, a transcendent dimension. So the Aboriginal person kind of lives in this kind of transcendental kind of world pretty much all the time. One who is, now I'm not saying, obviously, maybe not every Aboriginal person does that, but those who live in this kind of traditional world, of whom there are not that many now, have that sense of living within a world that is not just this physical world. It's a world that's shot through with all kinds of other things that are in that world. I mentioned how they see themselves in relation to their totem, by which they mean the kind of animal to which they're associated, which is generally part of the environment. So they are a rock kangaroo, for instance, so they come associated with that. Or it could be a particular tree or something else. So it isn't just, my name is Bill, and so I have this association with that. It's a deeper connection. So it's a much more spiritual connection. It's a recognition that everything around us is alive. The land is not just alive, but there's this other dimension in that world. It's alive with spiritual power. It's shot through with it, and if I'm awake to this. If I'm an Aboriginal person, so when I walk in that environment, if it's what I'm part of, I'm aware of all of that, and this is why when Aboriginal people were displaced from their land, they suddenly were nothing anymore. They did not any longer have the place from where they drew their spiritual strength. And they became a lost people. And you can see, why the tragedy of that. That over time that ability to be immersed in a place was no longer possible because you can't do that in a place that's not yours. It's not that you own that place; it's that you have a kind of sense in which your being is part of that place. In a sense that is very difficult for us to kind of, as coming from a Western world. Um, I mean, we do have some understanding of that, in the sense that if we are, for instance, I'm Latvian and I understand what it means to be Latvian and what it is to be in Latvia and in the place of my ancestors. And it's a special feeling. And so I think it's something like that. And I suppose for you, it's a bit like being in Romania. I mean, you can go to somewhere else and you can still be kind of Romanian, but you're disconnected from your country, from your place. Now, for the Aboriginal person, it's maybe a lot more than it's more than that. Their very being is contained in that place, and once you take that away, then they don't exist. They become nothing. They can't be themselves. They are on alien land if they're on somebody else's land. And they need to ask permission to be on that land if it's another tribe. You can't just enter it without making the right, paying the right respects and asking to be allowed on that land. So there are all kinds of ways in which once you're out of your land, you're not part of where you should be. You're not yourself anymore. In fact, you're less. You're a shadow, or less than a shadow. So that's a very different kind of image to the way in which we in the West perhaps think of our being, who we are.
Yes, and I think we have, as you said, a certain way of representing ourselves. It's a modern construction partly, but partly is something related with the Christian patristic origin uh, as hypostasis, as a way of individual way of being. But this composition of self, today's self, made us very unappropriate to understand this way of non-modern self,
Yeah,
Aboriginal. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. And I think as I said, I mean, there is within our tradition too a sense of connection to the land and to each other and to community and so on. But it's become lost, I think, in the, if you like, the noise of modern life. I mean, we don't any longer live in a kind of life which is so closely connected to nature. Um, and it's not possible for us to be able to live that kind of life anymore. So our sense of who we are has become kind of atomatized, I guess, the idea that we are individuals first, and then it's what I want. And so we have this big problem of I want to be free, and by that free we mean nobody else is allowed to tell me what to do. The Aboriginal person doesn't live that way. It doesn't accumulate things for self. They didn't have kings, and yes, there were men who were respected, and they were mostly men. There were some women, uh, but they were not considered kings or chiefs or any. There were no chiefs, and nobody thought to conquer somebody else's land because, well, that's not part of me, is it? So why would I want to take your land when it's not me? It's like saying I want to wear your clothes. Why would I do that? Firstly, they wouldn't fit me. So why would I do that? So the sense of taking somebody else's land just didn't exist. So there was no sense of ownership because I didn't own the land. So why would I take it? It's not mine to take, and it wouldn't be mine even if I did take it. So that idea just so there was never any wars over land. But it wasn't to say they didn't have war. There was war, but it wasn't over land. It would have been over other sorts of things. Somebody's wife being stolen, for example, or somebody doing something that was disrespectful or something of that kind. And so there would be wars from time to time, but these were always organised in a very specific kind of way. So they were very organised wars. So they'd come and shout obscenities at each other, throw a few spears, and then, okay, time to finish the war, and that would be the end of it. And you didn't want to you didn't want to harm anybody too much, like you didn't want to kill anybody because that would cause another lot of problems. If you killed someone, well, that means somebody's relatives now have a blood debt and they will now want to attack you, and that might be he might be from some other group or related to some other group, and then you've caused yourself more trouble with another group. So killing somebody was not a good idea. So if you speared them in the leg, everybody was happy, got your blood debt, and everybody could go home again. And of course because they travelled tended to be in small groups, you couldn't afford to get too many people killed because that would affect the survival of the group. And because everybody is within a kinship relationship, you have to be careful how much damage you do to any particular group, as I just said. So it had to be a limited kind of blood debt to be repaid. So all of that kind of thing. There were rules about the conduct of war and conduct of settling debts and so on that you had to follow. Most often it involved spearing in the leg. Sometimes it could mean killing, but that was a rare occurrence. You didn't deliberately go out and kill people, other people, because of this would create problems with other groups that somebody else was related to. So it had to be controlled in a very particular way. So while I won't, it wasn't a perfect society by any means. So some of the ethnographers tend to paint it as if this was the noble savage living a life of a good life within the world, and it was destroyed by the evil white people that came and destroyed that way of life. It's true we destroyed that way of life because it was a clash of two different metaphysical systems. Primarily, I say that, things about ownership of land, all of those things which we kind of take for granted were completely alien to Aboriginal people. They didn't know what that was all about. They didn't know about leadership. They didn't know, none of that made any sense. They lived a life according to a ritual, and they'd lived that life in this continent for upwards of 20,000 years. So nothing much had changed. And if you have this very stable kind of world, you can get a sense of eternity, I suppose, because everything moves the same way year after year after year after year after year, for thousands of years. So nothing changes. The Aboriginal people didn't spend a lot of time having to hunt and they didn't work in one sense. They just had enough to live on, and that's all they needed. So the rest of the time was spent in painting, rock art, in rituals of dancing and feasting, and they didn't have a life that was constrained by working 9 till 5. And it was very much connected to the land. Well, it's a very different way of life. And of course, once you have an industrial world meeting that, something's got to give. And what gives is that way of life is destroyed. You can't bring it back. There are still some tribes which practice some of this in the Northern Territory and up in the top end of Australia. None down here in the southern states, where I live. Not possible. And of course, we brought with us all kinds of diseases, all kinds of vices, which again helped destroy the way of life. And we took them off their land. Once you take them off that land, their whole sense of who they are is lost. They're nothing anymore. So there
But
is a tragedy there.
yeah, what we can discover is that there is something we talked about, and I had 2 issues in the journal on spiritual perception. I think we should talk about a different mindset. We should talk about something that is related with their way of connection to reality. And dreaming should be a key in understanding this sort of spiritual abilities of perceiving reality in a different way. And this is something very important, very different from everything I met in the other cultures. And yes, your presentation is very important for putting something very special in the puzzle. We already had some approaches from Jim Aguas on way of doing houses in connection with nature. Osman Bilen said something about the connection with nature from the Sufi perspective, and we will add some other very important perspectives like Ubuntu from South Africa. And probably later we will understand better the complexity of these cultural traditions and the mindset. It's about the abilities to perceive reality
absolutely.
in multiple ways, including spiritual senses, spiritual perception.
Yeah, and it's alien in some ways to a kind of scientific way of thinking about the world, which is very much a kind of materialistic way of understanding the world. That's why I mentioned phenomenology as a way of maybe helping to kind of grasp this, because we if you just think about a simple observation of a sunset, you know, I can describe the sunset scientifically. I can say, the light that I'm receiving is in the particular red spectrum band of whatever it is, 3,000 angstrom or whatever. Maybe it's longer, maybe the 3,000. Anyway, but it's I can talk about it in that kind of way and talk about, yes, it looks pink because it's the oxygen atoms in the atmosphere and bending. It's being refracted, and so the wavelength has been stretched a little, so it looks pink. And I can describe it in all that kind of that way. But I can also look at that sunset and get the sense of something transcendent in that. That I have a kind of contact with God. So we do have that. I think the Aboriginal person is even much more alive to that way of perceiving, because they see that whole landscape that they are immersed in, as sort of bubbling over with all of these possibilities, or all of these kinds of things that are there. And in a sense they're able to somehow perceive them, and I'm not quite sure how, but I get the idea, I guess, how that might work, but of course I'm not seeing it from within that kind of world. And it's very hard to get into that world. I mean, if you recall, Alistair McIntyre talks about, incommensurable kinds of theoretical ways of understanding the world. I mean, he gradually came away with the idea that there is no incommensurability, but I think with the Aboriginal way of seeing the world, we have something fairly close to incommensurability, but not entirely. I mean, because they're human beings like us after all, and if it's available to them as human beings, it's available to us too. So yeah, but it is difficult to find your way into that way of thinking about the world. It seems to me. I've only scratched the surface, I think, and I'm not Indigenous, so I'm not an Australian Aboriginal person. So I'm an old white man. um, but yeah, I think it's something that is important to appreciate and try to understand, and see that point of view as much as you can. Um, yeah.
Great. If there are some comments or questions.
Any? Yeah, Bianca.
First of all, Professor, thank you for such an inspirational lecture. I took a lot of notes, and in the same time, I felt that there is some point of immersion in the story of Aboriginal people, because the comfort of my home has immersed in other lands and spaces, and this is, I think, very important for a lecture. I discovered a lot of things that are in my research interest too. The idea of belonging to community and to the land is very special and very particular in the Aboriginal people. The idea
Yeah.
of connectedness, but I, I tried to understand, because the modern discourse in philosophy find um, the narratives of those people or of those societies, and what search is in the back of their societies. So my question is, if all these subtle layers of identity and community and kinship, um, is there a search behind that? So they were in searching of something, because you said that the dreaming is the intuition of a mystery. So if they lived everyday life in this very connected and very bond uh, relation with everything, were they in search of something else?
Well, that's a good question. Uh, I don't know that you can understand it as a search for something else, because you're already within that mystery.
Yes.
So you're not searching for anything more. You are living according to a particular understanding of your place within that dreaming, and you have, as an individual, responsibilities to that. So it's ensuring that. So the way of life is very stable, and your place is to and be responsible for your part of being within that world. So there isn't a. I mean, it's not to say that some people, for instance, there is some stories about how somebody becomes a Karaji, a medicine man, so to speak, or someone who is in contact with, or who has got closer contact with that spiritual realm. And there's a whole way in which you're initiated into that, and you've got to be chosen by, and it's quite, if you read it, it's a little bit frightening, really, the whole way in which you can be immersed within this world of what could be malign spirits and the like, and you have to die in one sense, and come back to life in a different way. I mean, so there is that sense in which that person has a initiation and a process to become one of these people who are attuned with. But it's not. In some ways, it's not so much that they are fulfilling some telos, I guess. I mean, if that's what you're talking about, it's because everything is existing at one time. So, what are you reaching for? You are the present and the past and everything. It's just a process that's happening. It's not like you're reaching to something else in a way. You're simply within that dreaming, within that process of being, and it's a kind of cyclical thing. It's stable. It doesn't change. You're living in eternity, so to speak. And it's within that there are cycles. I am initiated into this sacred mystery, and I become the Karaji, the medicine man, the sacred, if you like, elder, who has certain kinds of powers that are at the service of the community. You only become part of this in order to serve the community. You're not going to get rich, or you're not going to get extra axes or anything. It's just, this is what you do within the community. That's it. So it's a reenactment, and you're not doing you. You're not inventing, oh, I think I'll have a new ritual. No, you practice. You're not. You can develop new song lines and things like that, for instance. So it's not like there's no creativity, but so there is creativity and so it's these kinds of people that do develop new song lines, new ways of maybe telling a story. But it's only these special people who have that capacity, and that's not very many of them. So for the rest of us, it's a matter of continuing what happens. It's not just a kind of static thing either, because as I mentioned earlier, because of this connectedness with the land, you're also part of the process of living with the land and working with the land. So if there is, for example, drought, the land is suffering. If the land is suffering, then you have to try and do something about it. And one is you might have a ritual about bringing the rain about, or something of that kind. So or that the land is suffering for some other reason. Some malign spirit has done something, and so you might have to do a ritual that has to do with cleansing that land. It may be due to a breaking of the law in some kind of way. I mean, so there's all kinds of things. Now, I'm not privy to I don't know all of the ways in which you need to fix these things, but there is this kind of reciprocity is a key kind of value for Aboriginal peoples. And it's not just reciprocity in relation to other human beings, it's reciprocity in relation to other beings within the world. And that may be other spiritual beings. So it could be that, you've upset a particular inhabitant of the, cave, the spiritual beings that are part of that cave system or something, and you have to make amends in some kind of way, or something of that kind, or you've upset the balance in some way, and you have to redress that balance. So there is very much this idea of living within a kind of, well, not an eternity, but a kind of and dreaming is the best way to describe it, because what I dream may well affect what happens in the physical. So dreams and the physical are not considered separate. For instance, I might dream that my wife gets pregnant, right? And so she does. For them, the physical act may not necessarily be why she got pregnant. Maybe the spiritual act. So there's that kind of sense of these things not being disconnected. So yes, my wife got pregnant. I dreamt that she got pregnant, so she's pregnant. And you might think, oh, how silly. But in a way, you think about people who want to have children and they try to get pregnant and they can't, and there's no physical reason why they can't. So what's blocking that? It's not a physical thing. They test the man, they test the woman. Yes, they seem to be perfectly fertile, and yet they don't get pregnant. How do you explain that? Now, the Aboriginal person says, well, it's to do with the spiritual realm. And they'll have an explanation for that. Whether you accept that or not is another question, of course. And whether they're right or not is another question. But they do have a way of saying, well, look, these things have got to be in balance too, So it's not just the physical. There's the spiritual or mental, psychic element to our lives. And they're much more attuned to that, You will get pregnant. You dream about the rainbow serpent, you'll get pregnant. They'll have, and they might have a ritual associated with that too, that hopefully puts that mental thing back in line again. Now we maybe in our sort of scientific world think this is superstition, and it doesn't work. But we also have very little understanding of our lives as psychic and spiritual beings. We don't. In the world we live in is so kind of truncated with the contact with with nature itself and with the spiritual world. We don't have it as much anymore, and maybe the Aboriginal people were the last people that still had that, and some other more, if you like, people living outside of the cities and I think probably people that live in the country probably have a better sense of closeness to the land in a way that we don't, who live in the city. So there's lots of things, it seems to me, that within that kind of Aboriginal world, they're in touch with, that we think it's superstition. And maybe some of it is, but maybe some of it's not. Is really basically my view about this. There are things we may have lost because we live in this different environment, and that's you think about anything. There are things that we now use mobile phones, all the time. 10, 20 years ago, there virtually none. We had to go to a telephone box to ring somebody up. I mean, who even remembers what a telephone box looks like? So the kids today you tell them things about how life might have been once upon a time, and they don't understand it. So life has shifted. So, but for Aboriginal people, that was a life that went on and on for thousands of years, so tens of thousands of years, a long time. Anyway.
Well, even though it's very difficult for us to understand maybe just a little piece of this way of being, after this breaking point that you mentioned with Descartes, that we separated a lot of things, we end up to separate being and becoming. So becoming for us today is something that we are in search of, is something that we are lack of. And I found this very interesting that this Aboriginal people didn't felt this lack of something in their being. It's not a lack. It's just to be
Yeah,
to be
yeah,
connected
yeah,
and to be aware of this. And I think
yeah,
that even though these things, these very subtle things, are very difficult for us to comprehend, I think that this kind of encounters within projects, within technology, it's online now. We have this meeting online, but
yeah,
there is something more. Are these screens, are just these faces, but there is something more to discuss and to try to understand a pattern, a model from the past, not yours, because I cannot identify myself with this pattern, but
mm,
I can recognize some triggers maybe that can help me and the world around me to put another lens to reality. And I think this is
yeah,
very fruitful and very valuable. So thank you for
yes.
this, Professor Dan and Professor Ozolins.
You're
Yeah.
welcome. You're welcome. Well,
Yes. Thank you, John. It was great.
You're very welcome.
to to trouble our minds with new perspective of understanding what is really alien, different, and
Yes,
we need this kind of
yes,
we need this kind of test to test our mindsets.
we absolutely do. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very important, I think, to try and understand the other.
And maybe
You know,
to develop something in our ability to how to say to perceive reality.
yeah, there's something to be learnt from that. Um, yeah, yeah. I mean, an Aboriginal person in their own land knows that land, not just the physical land, but everything else about it. It's a whole different kind of understanding of reality. And it's something that's very difficult for us to grasp.
Yes, yes, but it's a good start. We as philosophers, we have to provoke people, students,
Yes, absolutely.
to be able to
Absolutely.
accept difference, to accept,
Yes.
and maybe to develop
Yes.
a different perception of what is the world, what is the transcendence. We need this.
Yes.
Otherwise,
And we see other horizons. We open up if we can see things from the other's point of view. We can develop new horizons that go well beyond our own. You know what? We see things in our own sort of little world. I mean, this is what Husserl was trying to get at, and Heidegger and Levinas more particularly. The idea that the other enables us, and the other who is different is even better because he'll stretch our horizons in different directions that we perhaps have not even thought of. So I think it's a very good thing to learn or try to learn in a humble kind of way. That
yes, yes.
we know very little ourselves. One has to remember. So it's always a process of learning. Yeah.
Thank you a lot. It was a great time to understand and to
So
learn. And
okay, well, do we end here or do you?
yes, recording.
Okay.